Let's get started. Story number 1.
The storm came in fast, turning the quiet winter night into a chaos of swirling snow and howling wind. I'd always loved the cabin my uncle left me, tucked away at the edge of Lake Cleary, surrounded by nothing but trees and wilderness. It was a place of peace, where time seemed to stop. But tonight, something felt wrong. The drive out here had been treacherous, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already setting. I'd barely managed to unload my supplies before the snow began to fall in earnest. Heavy, wet flakes clung to my jacket as I carried in firewood and lit the hearth. The cabin's single-room layout felt cozy with the flames crackling, the golden light chasing shadows into the corners. I was alone, but that was the plan. After a messy breakup and months of work stress, I needed time to think, to reset. Still, the isolation felt heavier than usual tonight, the storm making the familiar cabin seem smaller, more vulnerable. By the time darkness swallowed the world outside, the wind was rattling the windows, the snow piling high against the door. I tried to lose myself in a book, but my mind kept wandering. Shadows danced across the wooden walls, and the creaks and groans of the old structure seemed louder than usual. I told myself it was just the storm. But then the knock came. It was faint, barely audible over the wind. 3 soft raps at the door. I froze, staring toward it, my heart hammering in my chest. Who would be out here in this weather? The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the snow was falling so heavily that even getting to the main road would be impossible. I set the book down and stood, the floorboards creaking under my weight. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. No answer. Just the wind roaring against the cabin, the fire crackling behind me. I approached the door slowly, each step deliberate. My fingers hovered over the latch as I took a deep breath and swung it open. The icy wind hit me like a slap, but the porch was empty. The snow on the steps was undisturbed, untouched, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I stepped outside, shivering as I scanned the clearing. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. Beyond them, the lake was hidden in the darkness, its frozen surface invisible under the storm. I called out, my voice lost in the wind. "Is anyone there?" No response. I went back inside, bolting the door behind me. My hands were trembling, but I told myself it was just the cold. The storm was playing tricks on me. Maybe the wind had knocked something against the door. That had to be it. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The firelight seemed weaker now, the shadows deeper. I tried to focus on the book again, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my vision, a flicker of something just beyond the glass. Each time I looked, there was nothing but snow. And then the knocking started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. 3 sharp raps followed by a pause, then 3 more. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the wind, it couldn't be. I didn't move at first, my body frozen with fear. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was outside knew I was listening. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept toward the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just the knocking, persistent and unrelenting. I held my breath as I reached for the latch, throwing the door open once more. The cold air rushed in, and I shone the flashlight into the night. The porch was empty. But this time there were footprints. They led from the edge of the clearing to the door, the snow crushed into perfect, crisp impressions. Bare feet. The prints were narrow, like those of a child, and they stopped abruptly at the threshold. I stepped back inside, slamming the door shut. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The fire flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the walls. I backed away from the door, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, and then I heard it. A soft, high-pitched laugh, barely audible over the wind. It came from the window to my left. I whipped around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The glass was fogged from the cold, but as I stared, something moved on the other side. A face. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. The mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, the teeth too sharp, too perfect. It pressed its hands against the glass. Long fingers splayed and tilted its head as if studying me. I stumbled back, the flashlight falling from my hands. The face vanished, leaving nothing but the frost-covered window. I scrambled to pick up the light, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The laugh came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of footsteps, bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. But they weren't coming from outside. They were inside the cabin. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The room was empty, but the air felt charged, heavy with an oppressive weight. The fire dimmed, the shadows deepening until they seemed to move on their own. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The only answer was the sound of the footsteps, circling me, always just out of sight. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam bouncing off the walls. My chest felt tight, my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The storm outside was a death sentence, but staying here felt even worse. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent, the only sound my ragged breathing, and then, from the darkness, the voice came. "Let me in." It was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an edge that sent chills down my spine. I spun toward the sound, the flashlight illuminating the empty corner of the room. "Let me in," it said again, the voice echoing as if it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The fire went out. I was plunged into darkness, the flashlight flickering as the batteries drained. I dropped it, my hands trembling too much to hold it steady. The voice grew louder, repeating the same phrase over and over, "Let me in. Let me in." And then from behind me, a hand touched my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. The cabin was empty, but the air felt alive, pulsing with a malevolent energy. The voice was louder now, echoing in my head, drowning out every rational thought. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and plunging into the storm. The wind howled around me, the snow blinding, but I didn't care. I ran, my feet slipping on the ice, my lungs burning with every breath. I didn't stop until I reached the tree line, the cabin barely visible through the snow. I turned back, half expecting to see the pale figure watching me from the window, but the cabin was dark, its silhouette barely discernible against the storm. I stood there shivering, the cold seeping into my bones, and for a moment I thought I was safe. And then, faintly, I heard the knocking again. This time it wasn't coming from the cabin, it was coming from the trees. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The wind howled outside, whipping the snow in every direction, turning the world into a blur of white. It was a cold, bitter night, the kind that made your breath freeze in midair and your skin burn with the sharp sting of the winter chill. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the only light in the house was from a single flickering candle on the mantelpiece. Inside the small cabin, Sarah sat curled up in an old, worn armchair, clutching a woolen blanket around her shoulders. The fireplace crackled softly, sending occasional sparks up the chimney, but it offered little relief from the overwhelming cold. She glanced over at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. She had been alone for 2 days now, ever since her husband Mark had left to get supplies. He had been planning to return yesterday, but the storm had rolled in too fast, and the roads had become impassable. Sarah had tried not to worry at first, convincing herself that Mark would be fine, that he was just stuck somewhere. But with each passing hour, she felt the unease settling deeper in her chest. The isolation was what bothered her the most. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was far from civilization. The nearest neighbor was a couple of miles away, and even then, their house was rarely inhabited during the winter months. The snowstorm had cut them off entirely. As the wind howled and the house creaked under the weight of the storm, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the cold or the isolation. It was a nagging sense of being watched, a feeling that had grown stronger with each passing minute. Every time the wind slammed against the windows, she jumped, her heart skipping a beat. The feeling had started the night before, when she had gone to bed. She'd heard faint footsteps outside the door, slow and deliberate. At first she had dismissed them as the wind or the snow, but the sound had persisted, circling the cabin. She had gotten up, checked all the windows, and found nothing. But still, the feeling lingered. Tonight it was worse. She heard it again, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the wooden floor just outside the door. Her breath hitched. She wasn't imagining it this time. Her pulse quickened, and her mind raced. Could it be an animal? A bear, maybe, looking for shelter? She quickly dismissed the thought. No animal would be out in this weather. The door creaked open and Sarah froze, her body tense. The storm outside howled louder, but inside there was an eerie silence. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. Then she saw it, a shadow flickering in the dim candlelight. It was long and distorted, stretching across the floor like a figure creeping along the edge of the room. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping that when she opened them again, it would be gone. But when she opened them, the shadow was still there, moving closer. It was then that she realized it wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure grew clearer. It was tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness, as if the very air around it bent and twisted into a void. She could make out no details, just the outline of a tall, looming presence. Her hand trembled as she reached for the candle, but it flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she scrambled to her feet. She ran to the door, her fingers fumbling for the latch, but before she could open it, she heard a voice. Sarah. The whisper was low, barely audible over the wind, but it was unmistakable. It was Mark's voice, or at least, it sounded like him. Her hands shook as she turned toward the sound, but the figure was gone. She blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Mark? She whispered, her voice trembling. She wanted to believe it was him. She wanted to believe that somehow he had returned, that it was all just a misunderstanding, a trick of the mind, but there was something wrong, something off. The air in the room grew heavier, colder, as though the very temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold back the fear rising in her throat. Sarah? The voice was louder this time, clearer, but it still wasn't quite right. It was distorted, as if coming from far away, like a whisper carried on the wind, but just close enough to make her blood run cold. Her body froze as the whisper turned into a soft, guttural growl, like something trapped in the walls, clawing to get out. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, making her jump. The wind outside screamed louder, rattling the windows. Sarah ran to the window and peered out, her breath fogging up the glass. There was nothing but the blizzard, nothing but swirling white. But the sense of being watched, of something lurking in the dark, only grew stronger. The house groaned again, louder this time, as if it were alive, as if the very walls were closing in. She felt the air grow colder still, and she could see her breath now, swirling in front of her, misting the air. It felt like the temperature had dropped to impossible levels, as though the world outside had ceased to exist altogether. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps filled the room, slow and deliberate, just outside her door. They were unmistakable, not the random creaking of the house, but the sound of someone walking, someone who shouldn't be there. Mark? She whispered, her voice shaking. She turned back to the door, her hand resting on the cold wood, her pulse hammering in her ears. For a moment there was silence. Then the voice came again, this time in a harsh whisper, like a rasping breath in her ear. Open the door, Sarah. The door handle jiggled as though someone was trying to force their way in. Her heart raced and she backed away from the door, her body trembling. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but her legs felt like lead, frozen in place by terror. Open the door, the voice whispered again, growing more insistent, more desperate. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room fell into a suffocating silence, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, that made you feel like you were underwater. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she pressed herself against the wall, her body shaking uncontrollably. She waited, but nothing happened. The air remained cold, impossibly cold, but no more whispers, no more footsteps. It was as if whatever had been in the house had vanished as suddenly as it had come. But as Sarah stood there staring into the empty room, a chilling realization hit her. The door she had just heard being shaken, it wasn't locked. It had never been locked, and yet it hadn't opened. Her mind raced, her breath quickening as she turned back toward the window. She had to leave. She couldn't stay here, not with whatever that thing was. She had to find Mark, find someone. Get out of this house. But as she moved toward the door, something caught her eye, a shadow standing just behind her reflection in the window. She froze, her blood running cold. She didn't dare turn around. The shadow grew, stretching taller, and then it whispered again, close to her ear, so close that she could feel its breath against her skin. Sarah! She turned, but no one was there. The shadow in the window, however, remained. It wasn't hers. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The night had already fallen, and the wind was howling through the trees as if it had a purpose, as if it were trying to warn me. But I wasn't listening. I was alone, isolated in a cabin deep in the northern woods, far from any sign of civilization. It was a place I had always dreamed of visiting, but tonight, the beauty of the landscape felt more oppressive than peaceful. The snow had started falling hours ago, thick and heavy, burying the world in a blanket of white. There was no way out until morning, not unless I wanted to risk getting lost in the frozen wilderness. I wasn't afraid, at least not at first. It was the kind of place where people went to get away from it all, to find peace. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the forest, and the biting cold. But something about that night felt off. I had arrived earlier in the day, unpacked my things, and settled into the quiet rhythm of cabin life. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the wind outside only added to the charm of it all. The isolation was a welcome change. I didn't mind being alone. But after a while, I began to notice little things. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in the air, the strange way the shadows seemed to linger a little longer than they should have. I dismissed it, of course. The place had been empty for months before I arrived, and the house was probably settling. Still, as the night wore on, my unease grew. I sat by the fire trying to read, but the flickering light and the rhythmic sound of the wind outside seemed to blur my focus. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see something or someone outside. Nothing. Just the swirling snow, thick and relentless. Then came the knock. It was a soft, tentative rapping at the door. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, as if someone was waiting on the other side. Who would be out there in this weather at this hour? I stood up slowly, cautiously, my pulse quickening. The snow had been falling heavily since the afternoon, and there was no sign of any other tracks around the cabin. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. I walked to the door, hesitated, then reached for the handle. As I opened it, a gust of frigid air slammed against me, as if the wind itself were desperate to get inside. But there was nothing. The steps leading to the door were untouched, the snow pristine, undisturbed. I stepped outside, squinting into the swirling white haze of the storm. My breath came in clouds, my boots crunching on the snow beneath me. There was no one, just the relentless storm, the sound of the wind. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just the isolation, the quiet that felt like it was pressing in from all sides. Maybe the storm was playing tricks on me. I tried to shake off the unease, tried to focus on something, anything, other than the door. But the knock had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't normal, not in the middle of a storm like this. No one should have been out there. As I sat down by the fire, trying to settle my nerves, the noise came again. A tap, tap, tap at the window this time, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound, like fingers brushing against glass. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. The wind was howling outside, but the sound at the window didn't fit with the storm. It was deliberate, methodical. I moved cautiously toward the window, my breath fogging up the glass as I peered outside. The snow obscured everything, the swirling white making it nearly impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. But then, through the blizzard, I saw it. A figure. A tall figure standing just at the edge of the trees. Its face was obscured by the falling snow, but its outline was unmistakable. It was too still, too unnatural. It wasn't moving, just standing there, as though it were waiting for something. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, if the isolation and the storm had driven me mad. But the figure was still there. I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, throwing it open again and stepping out into the snow, my boots sinking deep into the powder. I had to know who it was, what they wanted. Maybe they were just a lost traveler, someone who had gotten caught in the storm. But when I reached the spot where I had seen the figure, there was nothing. The snow was untouched, the ground smooth and unmarked. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there at all. My pulse was hammering in my ears now, the fear creeping up from the pit of my stomach. It didn't make sense. I had seen someone. I had to have. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. The wind outside had only gotten stronger, the storm worsening with each passing minute. The sound of the snow against the windows was deafening. But then the knock came again. A soft, persistent tapping at the door like someone was standing just outside, waiting. I didn't dare open it this time. I just stood there, frozen in place, my breath shallow and fast. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that whatever was out there, whatever had been knocking, was waiting for me to make a move. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, this time harder, more insistent, followed by the sound of something scraping against the door, as if something with sharp fingers was dragging them across the wood. I ran for the phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I hadn't expected there to be. I was too far out, too isolated. No one would hear me scream, and even if they did, no one could get to me. Then came the whisper. It was soft at first, a barely audible sound carried on the wind. But as it grew louder, I could make out the words, "Let me in." The voice was soft and ragged, as if it had been carried across 1,000 miles of cold and empty space. It was a voice that seemed to come from all around me, the walls, the air, the very ground beneath my feet. The words echoed in my mind, leaving a chill that seeped into my bones. "Let me in." I backed away from the door, my heart racing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and I could hear the tapping, the scraping, now all around the cabin, as if the figure from outside had somehow moved in closer. The windows rattled as if something was pushing against them from the outside. The temperature dropped, the air growing thick with an oppressive cold that numbed my skin and my thoughts. It felt as though the very house was closing in on me, the walls pressing in tighter, the darkness stretching toward me. The knocking stopped. The whispering stopped. The silence was deafening. But when I looked toward the window again, the figure was there once more, standing just outside. This time it wasn't at the edge of the trees. It was at the window, its face pressed against the glass, its eyes wide and black, staring directly at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure's lips parted, and I heard the whisper again, closer this time, like it was right behind me. "Let me in." And then the window shattered. The glass exploded inward with a deafening crash, and the figure reached inside. I screamed, stumbling backward, my hands trying to shield my face. The air around me was thick with the scent of cold earth and decay, and the shadows in the room seemed to pulse as if they had taken on a life of their own. There was a soft laugh, hollow and distant, and then nothing. The storm outside had stopped. The fire in the hearth flickered out, and I was alone. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The wind keened through the skeletal branches of the birch trees, the sound rising and falling like a mournful song. Tom adjusted his scarf, pulling it tighter against his face, as he trudged through the thick snow covering the narrow path. The storm had died down hours ago, leaving the world eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of ice-laden branches above. Tom hadn't planned on being out this late, but he had underestimated the time it would take to retrieve supplies from the small town 10 miles from the cabin. The sun had dipped below the horizon faster than he anticipated, and now the woods were bathed in pale moonlight, the snow glowing faintly beneath his boots. His cabin wasn't far now, less than a mile by his estimate. A warm fire, a hot meal, and the comfort of 4 solid walls were all he could think about as he pressed forward, his breath coming in visible puffs that dissolved into the night. The woods around him were dense, the shadows between the trees impossibly dark. He kept his flashlight trained on the path ahead, the beam cutting through the gloom, but something about the night felt off. It wasn't the cold or the darkness. Those were expected. It was the stillness, the complete, unnatural silence that seemed to envelop everything. Even the wind had stopped. Tom paused, listening. He couldn't hear the usual nocturnal sounds of the forest. No rustling leaves, no distant hoots of owls, no scurrying of small animals beneath the snow. It was as if the entire forest were holding its breath. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pushed on, telling himself he was imagining things. The mind plays tricks in the dark, he thought. You're just tired. The path twisted and turned, and as he rounded a bend, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Ahead, in the middle of the trail, was a figure. At first he thought it was a person. A tall man, perhaps, dressed in dark clothing, but as he stared, his stomach churned with unease. The figure wasn't moving. It stood utterly still, its outline blurry and indistinct, like a shadow cast by something that wasn't there. "Hello?" Tom called, his voice hoarse and uncertain. The figure didn't respond. It remained motionless, its head tilted slightly as if watching him. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He took a cautious step forward, shining his flashlight toward the figure. The beam should have illuminated it, but instead the light seemed to pass right through, scattering into the trees beyond. A cold dread settled over him. "Who's there?" he demanded, trying to sound braver than he felt. His voice echoed in the stillness, but there was no answer. The figure didn't move. Tom took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to turn and run. But the cabin was so close, he could feel it. If he could just get past this, whatever it was, he'd be safe. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Tom started walking again, his eyes locked on the shadowy figure. As he drew closer, it began to change. It seemed to ripple, like smoke caught in a draft, its edges flickering and shifting. And then it was gone. One moment it was there, solid and foreboding, and the next it had dissolved into the night. Tom stopped, his breath hitching. He swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of the figure, no footprints in the snow where it had been standing. He wanted to believe he had imagined it, that it was a trick of the light or a figment of his tired mind. But deep down, he knew better. He broke into a run, his boots crunching loudly in the snow as he barreled down the path. The cabin came into view moments later, its outline barely visible against the dark forest. Relief flooded through him as he reached the front door and fumbled with the key, his hands shaking. Once inside, he slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against the wood as he tried to catch his breath. The cabin was cold. The fireplace, nothing but smoldering embers. Tom hurried to light it, his hands trembling as he struck a match and set it to the kindling. Flames crackled to life, bathing the room in a warm, flickering glow. He sat down heavily in the armchair by the fire, his heart still racing. He tried to convince himself it was over, that whatever he had seen, or thought he had seen, was gone. But the unease lingered. As the fire grew, casting long shadows across the room, Tom noticed something strange. The shadows weren't right. They seemed to move independently of the flames, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. He froze, his eyes fixed on the wall across from him. One shadow in particular caught his attention, a tall, thin figure that didn't match anything in the room. It stood perfectly still, just like the figure on the path. Tom's mouth went dry. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his ears. There was nothing there. He whipped back around and the shadow was gone. A loud creak echoed through the cabin, making him jump. It came from upstairs, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Tom's mind raced. He hadn't been upstairs since he'd arrived days ago. There was nothing up there but an old, unused bedroom and a storage closet. The footsteps continued, moving back and forth, methodical and unhurried. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. Tom stood, his legs shaky, and grabbed the fire poker from the hearth. He didn't want to go upstairs, but he couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever it was to come to him. He climbed the stairs slowly, the fire poker clutched tightly in his hand. The hallway was dark, the moonlight filtering through the small window at the end. He could see the door to the bedroom, slightly ajar. The storage closet was closed. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the bedroom door open. The room was empty, just as he'd left it. The bed was neatly made, the furniture undisturbed. He checked the closet, but it too was empty. He turned to the storage closet, his palms slick with sweat. He gripped the fire poker tighter and yanked the door open. Nothing. Tom exhaled shakily, relief washing over him. He closed the door and turned back to the stairs, and froze. The shadow was at the end of the hallway, standing motionless, just like before. It was taller now, its edges sharper, more defined. It was no longer just a shadow, it was something else, something dark and unnatural. Tom backed away, his chest tightening. The shadow didn't move, but the air around it seemed to pulse, growing heavier and colder. The hallway seemed to stretch, the distance between him and the figure impossibly long. The light from his flashlight flickered and died. In the darkness, the whispering began. Low and guttural, it surrounded him, filling his ears and his mind. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. Tom stumbled back down the stairs, nearly tripping in his haste. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, leaving the room dim and cold. He grabbed his coat and boots, not caring about the storm or the snow. He had to leave. He had to get out of the cabin, out of the woods, away from whatever this was. As he opened the door, he felt it behind him, a presence, heavy and oppressive. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The cold air hit him like a wall as he stepped outside, but he welcomed it. The shadows of the forest seemed to shift and writhe around him, but he kept moving, his boots crunching through the snow as he made his way back toward the road. The whispering followed him, growing louder, more insistent. He didn't stop, didn't turn around, even as the shadows closed in, even as the air grew so cold it burned his lungs. By the time he reached the edge of the woods, the whispering had stopped. The shadows were gone. But the feeling of being watched never left him. Tom never returned to the cabin. When spring came, he sold the property, unwilling to set foot there again. He never told anyone what he had seen, but sometimes, on cold winter nights, he would wake in a sweat, the sound of whispers still echoing in his ears. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the kind of winter night that made you feel like the world had been abandoned. The snow fell relentlessly, muffling every sound, turning the landscape into an endless stretch of white. The wind hissed through the trees, its mournful wail carrying a strange, haunting quality that made my skin crawl. I had never been afraid of the woods before, but tonight felt different, like something was watching. The cabin sat deep in the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a place to clear my head after the chaos of the past year. My father had built it decades ago, and I had spent many winters here as a child, surrounded by the comforting warmth of the fire and the steady hum of family life. But now, with my parents gone and my siblings scattered across the country, the cabin felt more like a relic of the past, a hollow shell of what it used to be. I arrived just before dusk, the sun sinking low behind the snow-laden pines. The drive had been treacherous, the winding roads slick with ice, but I had made it. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in before the storm worsened. The cabin was just as I remembered it, rustic and sturdy, with heavy wooden beams and a stone fireplace that dominated the living room. The only light came from the fire and a few oil lamps scattered around the space. There was no electricity here, no cell service, just the solitude of the forest and the promise of a quiet night. As the hours passed, the storm intensified. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the windows in their frames. I sat by the fire, sipping a mug of tea, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled over me. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind battered its walls, and every so often I would hear a sharp crack as a branch snapped under the weight of the snow. It was around midnight when I heard the first knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but in the stillness of the cabin, it was unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself it was the wind, or perhaps a branch tapping against the side of the house. But then it came again, 3 deliberate knocks, slow and rhythmic, like someone was standing just outside the door. I set my mug down and stood, every nerve in my body on edge. Who would be out here in this weather? The cabin was miles from the main road, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. My first thought was that someone might be lost, a traveler who had taken a wrong turn and needed shelter. But the rational part of me knew how unlikely that was. I moved to the door and hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking slightly. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the wind, howling through the trees like a wounded animal. I waited, my breath fogging in the cold air, but the knocking didn't come again. After a few moments, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the storm. I locked the door and returned to my seat by the fire, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to focus on the book I had brought with me, but the words blurred together, my mind unable to concentrate. The cabin felt different now, the air heavy with a tension I couldn't explain. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light casting flickering shadows across the walls. I found myself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at me from the darkness. And then the knocking started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. 3 sharp raps, followed by a pause, then 3 more. My stomach twisted in fear. I stood slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. The sound was deliberate, purposeful. Someone, or something, was out there. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and moved toward the door, my hands trembling. "Who's there?" I called again, louder this time. The only answer was the wind, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I unlatched the door and threw it open. The cold hit me like a slap, the wind whipping snow into my face. I shone the flashlight into the darkness, scanning the porch and the clearing beyond. There was nothing, no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there. The forest stood silent and still, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I stepped outside, the snow crunching under my boots, and swept the beam of the flashlight across the clearing. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is someone out there?" The words disappeared into the void, swallowed by the storm. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the freezing air, before retreating back inside and locking the door behind me. The fire had burned low, and the cabin felt colder than before. I added another log to the hearth, trying to push back the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. As I sat there staring into the flames, I heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a knock. It was a voice. A faint, whispering voice, just outside the window. I couldn't make out the words, but it was there, low and guttural, like someone murmuring under their breath. My blood ran cold. I turned slowly, my eyes darting to the window nearest the fire. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the snow beyond the glass. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to move, circling the cabin, coming from different directions. My heart was racing now, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be the wind, I told myself. The storm was playing tricks on my ears, but deep down I knew better. I stood, my legs shaky, and moved toward the window. My hand reached for the curtain, hesitating for just a moment before pulling it back. Nothing. The snow was untouched, the forest silent and still, but as I stared out into the darkness, a sudden movement caught my eye, a shadow darting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It was quick, almost too quick to be human. I blinked, straining to see through the swirling snow, but the shadow was gone. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow worse. I felt a presence now, something unseen but undeniably there. It was watching me, waiting. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop, the air growing colder with each passing second. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I felt a creeping dread settle over me. The fire flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room, and then from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure. It stood just outside the window, its face pale and expressionless, its dark eyes locked onto mine. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in its gaze, and then it was gone. One moment it was there, and the next, it had vanished, leaving nothing but the swirling snow and the faint reflection of the firelight in the glass. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, and grabbed the flashlight again. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about the storm, didn't care about the risk. Staying in the cabin felt far more dangerous. I threw on my coat and boots, my fingers fumbling with the laces. The wind screamed outside, shaking the cabin, and for a moment, I thought the door might burst open. I grabbed my bag, not bothering to pack anything, and made for the door. But as I reached for the handle, the whispering started again. It was louder now, more distinct, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it was coming from inside the cabin. My head snapped around, and there it was, the figure standing by the fire, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, and bolted for the door. The last thing I heard as I stumbled out into the snow was the sound of the fire dying, the cabin plunging into darkness. I ran blindly into the storm, the snow blinding me, the cold biting at my skin. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get away. The whispering followed me, carried on the wind, growing fainter the further I went. By the time I reached the main road, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I collapsed into the snow, my body trembling, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I looked back, the cabin was gone, swallowed by the forest. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The wind howled through the trees, a sharp, bitter gust that cut straight through the thick layers of wool and fur that Samantha had wrapped around herself. It was the kind of winter night that felt like the world was on pause, a frozen breath suspended in time. The snow had been falling for hours, thick and heavy, turning the landscape into a pale blur of white. Samantha had always been drawn to the quiet of the winter woods, but tonight, something was different. The air was colder, the silence deeper, almost suffocating. She wasn't supposed to be out here. Her parents had warned her not to venture too far from the cabin, but she had grown restless inside, pacing back and forth, staring out the frosted window at the endless white. The idea of being cooped up with nothing but the crackling fire and the soft murmur of their conversation made her feel trapped, smothered. So, she decided to take a walk, just for a little while. The path through the woods was barely visible, obscured by the thick blanket of snow. She had grown up in these woods, knew them like the back of her hand. But tonight, even the familiar trails seemed unfamiliar, as though the forest had shifted, reshaped itself in her absence. She tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine as she trudged through the deep snow, her boots crunching with each step. It wasn't long before she felt the first pangs of doubt. The wind had picked up and the trees groaned, their branches creaking under the weight of the snow. The forest, once so peaceful, now seemed alive with strange sounds, whispers on the wind, rustling noises in the underbrush. But when she paused and listened, there was nothing but the wind. She turned back toward the cabin, but found the landscape had changed. The woods were no longer familiar. The trees, once spaced apart in neat rows, were now huddled together in dark, menacing clumps. The path that had led her here was gone, swallowed by the snow. Panic began to creep in. She called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Mom? Dad?" There was no answer. Her heart started to pound in her chest, and her breath quickened, swirling in clouds of mist before her face. She was alone. She had always been alone when she ventured out here, but tonight felt different. The weight of the isolation pressed down on her, heavier than it had ever been before. She felt like she was being watched, though there was no one to be seen. She wrapped her arms tighter around her body and forced herself to keep moving, hoping she would come across something familiar, anything. But the forest had other plans. The further she walked, the more the woods seemed to close in around her. The trees leaned toward her, their dark limbs stretching out like twisted fingers. Her heart was pounding now, each beat echoing in her ears. The snow, once pristine and untouched, was now marred with strange, uneven marks. Footprints, though not her own. The tracks led deeper into the woods, further from the path she had tried to follow. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She should turn back. She should have never left the cabin in the first place. But something kept her moving forward, some force pulling her deeper into the woods, urging her to follow the mysterious tracks. She didn't know why she couldn't stop herself. The snow crunched beneath her feet with every step. But there was something else now, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a dragging, shuffling noise that seemed to follow her. She spun around, her eyes darting through the dark woods, but there was nothing there. No figures, no movement, just the silent expanse of snow and trees. She took a few steps forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound of the shuffling grew louder, closer, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She wasn't alone. There was something, someone behind her. Her eyes scanned the trees. Something was moving among them, just out of sight. She felt it now, the presence, cold and malevolent, pressing in from all sides. Her legs were frozen in place, her feet refusing to move. Every part of her wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the chill biting into her skin. Her breath came in clouds now, quick and panicked. And then, through the thick mist of her breath, she saw it, a figure, barely visible in the dark, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, and though its features were obscured by the night, there was something deeply wrong about its shape. Samantha's blood ran cold. It was not a person. The figure shifted, its movements slow and unnatural, like a creature not accustomed to walking. The air crackled with an energy she couldn't understand, and the whispering wind seemed to grow louder, as though the trees themselves were murmuring. "Get away from me," she whispered, more to herself than to the figure. But the words barely left her lips before it moved again, closer this time. Its eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto hers, and for a split second she felt like it was staring straight into her soul. She spun on her heel, panic overtaking her senses. She ran, her boots slipping in the snow, her breath ragged and sharp in her chest. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the trees warping and distorting around her. She couldn't find the path. She couldn't find the cabin. Only the deep, oppressive silence of the forest and the shuffling noise that followed her every step. A sharp cry broke the silence, one that wasn't her own. She froze, her body trembling as the sound echoed through the trees. It was distant, like a scream carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable, human, terrified. Someone else was out here. She turned and ran toward the sound, hoping, praying it was her parents. The snow kicked up around her feet, the world spinning with panic, and then nothing. Silence again, only the whistling wind and the crunch of snow beneath her feet. The trees loomed over her like dark sentinels, and the darkness pressed in from every angle. She could still feel the eyes on her, could still hear the shuffling, dragging noise, but it was no longer behind her. It was ahead. The figure had found her. Samantha didn't stop running. She couldn't. Her legs burned, her breath burned, and the cold gnawed at her bones, but she kept moving. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape. And then, through the trees, she saw it. A faint, flickering light in the distance. The cabin. She wasn't far. But before she could take another step toward it, a voice, soft, chilling, whispered through the wind. "You can't escape." The words froze her in her tracks. The figure was standing before her now, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, its body towering over her. The air around them seemed to warp, thick with an oppressive presence, and she could hear the faintest sound of breath, slow and deep, like something ancient and malevolent. Samantha couldn't move. Her heart was in her throat, her body paralyzed by fear. The snow around her had stopped falling, and the world was still, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the shadows of the trees, disappearing without a trace. Samantha stood there, trembling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Was it real? Had she imagined it? Her body was trembling uncontrollably now, like the shock setting in as the weight of the terror she had felt crashed down on her. She didn't waste another moment. She ran toward the cabin with all the strength she had left, not daring to look back. When she reached the door, she slammed it shut behind her, locking it with shaking hands. Her parents were sitting by the fire, looking up at her with concern. "Samantha, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She could still feel the presence, could still hear the faintest shuffling, but when she looked out the cabin window, all she saw was the thick blanket of snow, undisturbed and peaceful. But she knew better. The forest was alive, and it was waiting. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The wind lashed against the old cabin, shrieking through the pine trees like a living thing. Ellie pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood by the frost-covered window, peering into the endless night. The storm had come out of nowhere, fierce and unrelenting, burying the forest in an impenetrable white shroud. She'd been trapped here for 3 days now, snowbound and completely alone. She hadn't meant to stay this long. The cabin was supposed to be a weekend retreat, a quiet escape from the noise of city life. Ellie had planned to write, relax, and return home before the worst of winter set in. But when the snow began falling on Sunday afternoon, it hadn't stopped. By Monday evening, the narrow road leading to the cabin was buried, cutting her off from the world. The isolation didn't bother her at first. She'd always loved the stillness of the woods in winter, the way the snow muffled every sound and made the world seem softer, more peaceful. But as the hours dragged on, the silence began to feel oppressive. The cabin, once a cozy haven, now felt cold and strange, as if the walls were holding their breath. It was just after midnight when she first noticed the sound. At first, she thought it was the storm, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like branches swaying in the wind. But as she sat by the fire, staring into the flames, she realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin, upstairs. Her heart skipped a beat. She set her book down and listened, straining to hear over the wind's howling. There it was again, a soft, deliberate creak, like someone walking across the wooden floor above her. Ellie forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. The cabin was old. It settled and groaned, especially in weather like this. It was nothing. She told herself that over and over as she stoked the fire and returned to her book, but her eyes kept flicking to the ceiling. The sound didn't stop. By the time the clock struck 1, Ellie was certain she wasn't imagining it. The creaking had grown louder, more distinct, moving back and forth across the second floor. Her mind raced with possibilities. A raccoon? A stray cat that had somehow gotten inside? She didn't want to consider the other, darker scenarios, ones that involved someone else being in the cabin with her. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing the heavy flashlight from the table, she made her way to the staircase. Each step felt like a battle against the fear coiling in her chest. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness as she climbed, illuminating the narrow hallway at the top. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The only response was the howl of the wind outside. She moved cautiously, checking each room one by one. The bedroom, the bathroom, the tiny storage closet, all empty. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As she turned to head back downstairs, the flashlight flickered and went out. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She smacked the flashlight against her palm, desperate to coax it back to life, but it stayed dark. The faint glow from the fireplace downstairs barely reached the top of the stairs, leaving her in near total darkness. That was when she heard it, a whisper, low and indistinct, like the rustle of dry leaves. It came from behind her, from the far end of the hallway. Ellie's stomach turned to ice. She didn't move, didn't breathe, straining to catch the words, but they were too faint, too distant. Then the whispering stopped, and the footsteps began. They were slow and deliberate, each step a sharp crack against the wooden floor. They were coming toward her. Ellie bolted. She didn't look back as she stumbled the stairs, nearly tripping in her panic. She reached the living room and slammed the door at the bottom of the staircase shut, her hands shaking as she slid the latch into place. The sound of her own breathing filled the room, ragged and shallow. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then faintly, she heard the footsteps again, pacing back and forth above her. She sank to the floor, clutching the flashlight to her chest like a talisman. She didn't sleep that night. When morning finally came, the storm had eased. The snow was still deep, but the sky was clear, pale blue streaked with the soft pink of sunrise. Ellie wasted no time. She threw on her coat and boots, grabbed her bag, and headed for the door. She didn't care if she had to walk for miles. She couldn't stay here another night. But when she opened the door, she stopped dead in her tracks. The snow on the porch was pristine, untouched by even a single footprint. But leading away from the cabin, winding into the woods, were tracks. Large, uneven prints, like something or someone had been pacing back and forth in front of the cabin all night. Ellie's breath caught as she followed the trail with her eyes. The tracks led to the edge of the trees, where they stopped abruptly, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. She didn't wait to find out more. Slinging her bag over her shoulder, she started down the snow-covered road, her boots crunching loudly in the stillness. The cabin faded into the distance, but the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something or someone was still following her, just out of sight. When Ellie finally reached the main road hours later, she flagged down a passing car. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, listened patiently as she recounted her ordeal. He didn't laugh or dismiss her fears. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first," he said, his voice grave. "That cabin's been trouble for years. People hear things, see things. Some don't come back at all." Ellie stared at him, her blood running cold. "What do you mean?" The man glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's the land, that something happened there a long time ago. Others say it's the storm, that it calls to the restless dead. Ellie shuddered, clutching the blanket he'd offered her tightly around her shoulders. She didn't look back as the car pulled away, leaving the cabin and whatever haunted it far behind. Story the end.